All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today. This webinar is on federal cost-benefit analysis policy for evaluating nature-based solutions projects. I'm really happy to see everyone who could be here live, but we will be recording today's session so that anyone who missed out can watch it later. And we'll be sending around a link to everyone who registered with that recording. My name is Sarah Mason. I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. And I'm just going to kick us off today to start the webinar, introduce the series, and then we can dive in. And I'll be handing it off to Jeff Peterson, who is our moderator. After all the presentations are finished, we will have a Q&A session. So if you do have questions for our presenters, please type them into the Q&A box and we can try to get as many of those questions answered as possible at the end. So this webinar is the third session of a series called Current Issues in Nature-Based Solutions. And with growing interest in nature-based solutions coming from both the public and private sectors, along with a strong desire to scale up implementation, we wanted to host a series of presentations and conversations around nature-based solutions, effectiveness, execution, funding, and policies. So this series is being hosted by the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, or NESP, as well as the Resilience Roadmap Project. NESP is a coordinating platform for a network of public and private individuals and organizations working on implementation of ecosystem services concepts at the national level in the US. And the Resilience Roadmap is a project aimed at gathering expertise on climate resilience policy in the US and making actionable recommendations for how to build greater resilience through federal action. We're very lucky to have the Coastal Flood Resilience Project co-hosting today's session. And I will let our moderator, Jeff Peterson, who comes from the Coastal Flood Resilience Project, tell you a little bit more about it when I hand the mic off to him. I'm going to provide links now to all of the hosting organizations in the chat if you do want to learn more about any of those. I do also want to note that we have another session planned next Wednesday on January 18th, where we'll be joined by the authors of the recently released Nature-Based Solutions Roadmap for the United States to discuss the development and rollout of that document. We also have a few other sessions in the works, so please stay tuned as we get those scheduled. And I can drop a link momentarily to register for future sessions in the chat. If you do want to stay informed about these and other upcoming events, you can sign up for the NESP mailing list, which means you'll get our quarterly newsletter and future webinar announcements. And you can either do that using the QR code on the screen or through the link that I will put into the chat. So with all of that out of the way, I will hand things off now to Jeff Peterson, who's one of the co-facilitators of the Coastal Flood Resilience Project, to get us started. Thanks so much again for joining.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. I'm Jeff Peterson with the Coastal Flood Resilience Project, and I'll be moderating today's event. The Coastal Flood Resilience Project is a coalition of nonprofit organizations working to strengthen response to more severe storms and rising seas along the US coast. There's lots more information about the project on the web at www.cfrn.info. US federal agencies use cost-benefit analysis to make decisions about the types of infrastructure projects to implement. Current federal cost-benefit analysis policies tend to favor gray infrastructure projects over nature-based solutions. Our goal today is to hear from experts working to encourage selection of nature-based solutions and consider how existing federal policies might be updated to enable more nature-based solutions to be implemented. I'm delighted to be joined by three distinguished panelists representing organizations all working to promote nature-based solutions and project designs. Sarah Ritter is the Associate Vice President for Water and Coasts at the National Wildlife Federation. In this role, Jessie leads the development and execution of NWF's National Water Resources and coastal policy priorities. She oversees federal campaigns to protect clean water and wetlands and increase the resilience of communities and wildlife in the face of climate change and natural disasters. Sarah Murdoch serves as the Senior Director at the U.S. Land for U.S. Land and Water Policy at the Nature Conservancy. Her work has focused extensively on advancing federal policy associated with mainstreaming investments in nature-based solutions. Jordan R. Fischbach, PhD, is the Director of Planning and Policy Research at the Water Institute of the Gulf. Dr. Fischbach's policy research focuses on climate adaptation, urban resilience, water resources management, coastal planning, and post-disaster recovery. So today's webinar is divided into 3 sections. First, each of the panelists will give a short presentation describing their work and encouraging the wider use of nature-based solutions. Second, the panelists will respond to some general questions about promoting nature-based solution in a discussion format. And then third, we'll be taking questions from the audience, and please input any questions through the chat function, and we'll try and make sure we ask as many as possible. Finally, we will post a recording of the webinar on the websites of the sponsoring organizations and provide a link to anyone participating. If you have technical issues, please send a chat to Sarah. And with that, I will give the floor to Jessie Ritter for the first presentation.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And let me go ahead and share screen here. All right. And flip this around. Okay, does that look all right on everyone else's side? Great. Well, thank you again for the introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this exciting and very timely webinar series discussing the different facets and challenges and issues related to nature-based solutions. I'm excited to discuss some of the work we've been doing, but also to provide an overview to kind of tee us up here for our discussion specifically about benefit cost analysis and how the implications of BCAs for nature-based solutions. So for folks that might not be familiar with the National Wildlife Federation, we are a national conservation, education, and advocacy organization. We work closely with a network of 52 state and territorial affiliates, and we have regional offices around the nation where we are working to advance a whole slew of issues related to helping wildlife and people thrive in the face of climate change. My team focuses primarily on policy as it relates to water resources and disaster resilience, and advancing nature-based solutions is a really core portion of our work. So just to tee things off today, I'm assuming most folks who've tuned in are already fairly familiar with benefit cost analysis, but just by way of some table setting. In the simplest economic terms, when we're talking about a benefit cost analysis, we mean a process that's used to compare the projected or estimated costs and benefits associated with a project decision. It's often used, as Jeff has described in his introduction, by federal agencies for comparing or ranking different projects. And it's often expressed in terms of a ratio. So for many federal decisions, in order for a project to advance and receive federal funding, it must demonstrate a benefit cost ratio of 1 or greater. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to share a little bit more about how this economic tool is applied by 2 federal agencies that together have a really large role in our nation's overall resilience and in advancing nature-based solutions. And that's the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA. I'm going to share a little more on some of the challenges we see, but also some of the opportunities within the sphere of both of these agencies' jurisdiction to make some progress on how we apply benefit cost analysis in a way that could advance nature-based solutions. So just to kick us off with the Army Corps, one of the first references that we have to benefit cost considerations in federal policy for the Corps dates all the way back to the Flood Control Act of 1936. And so this is a concept, a methodology that the Army Corps has been applying to its planning and decision-making process for a very long time. Today, the Corps completes a benefit cost analysis for flood risk reduction projects and for navigation projects to compare the economic benefits of different project alternatives. And the quality and the reliability of the benefit cost analyses that emerge are really important because they do shape federal decision-making. And in fact, executive branch budget development guidance for the Corps over the past decade uses benefit cost ratio thresholds as one of the primary performance metrics for selecting which projects to propose for funding. So there are some challenges that we see in terms of how benefit cost analyses have historically been applied by the Army Corps. On the benefit side of the equation, there are a lot of important ecological and social benefits that are often left out of the calculation. And this is in part because some of these things are, as you'll hear us talk about today, more challenging to quantify. In some cases, we see that it's difficult to equitably evaluate flood damage benefits because of some of the approaches used that may rely on things like home price values that could result in projects benefiting lower income areas where home values are lower, being at a disadvantage as compared to other projects. We also see examples where the Army Corps counts benefits from activities that are actually contrary to sound resource management or best practices. So things like intensified use of floodplains and development in wetland or floodplain areas. So those are some of the challenges. We often talk about emphasis on the issues with the benefits side of the equation when we're talking about benefit cost analyses, but there can also be some significant inaccuracies and challenges with the cost side of the calculation that can have major implications for the final BCR ratio and what projects advance. And so I'm not going to go super deep here, but we do see that it's very common that the construction costs of projects are underestimated. That can be because of delays in project funding, inflation costs, the need for design changes due to changing environmental conditions. We can also see that oftentimes we fail to really fully capture and quantify the cost of ecosystem services lost as a result of project construction and operation. And then, of course, any shifting of risk onto downstream or surrounding communities is not always adequately captured either. So just to kind of highlight the point that the failure to meaningfully assess the actual conditions on the ground mean that if the cost side of the equation isn't accurate, the overall ratio itself can misrepresent the relative benefit of one project to the nation over another. So some key opportunities in the Army Corps space. There are some, kind of exciting things ahead of us, and you will hear a little bit later the analysis that the Water Institute of the Gulf worked on regarding efforts to improve how we account for nature-based solutions as part of project planning and analysis. So that's an exciting development. We also expect later this year to see a rulemaking for the Army Corps' agency-specific procedures to finally implement the principles, requirements, and guidelines for water resource projects. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about this hopefully in our discussion session, but this could really fundamentally change the way the Army Corps goes about planning projects and can have significant implications for things like benefit cost. One point that I just want to underscore is that even with some near-term opportunities to continue to improve the accuracy and the completeness of benefit cost analyses, there are just inherent limitations in fully capturing all of the considerations as it relates to kind of ecological services and also equity considerations through quantitative assessments. The National Research Council said it well in this quote here, which is that BCAs should be used to inform and support decisions and not as a precise decision rule. Benefit cost analyses alone aren't going to get us to the most equitable or environmentally protective solutions if we aren't evaluating the right types of projects in the first place. So it's really important, as we discuss this and as we continue to advance the science around benefit cost, that we make sure federal policy requirements and best practices are followed so that nature-based solutions, for example, are actually included in the final array of alternatives that advance to this more detailed analysis and assessment. So switching gears to FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA requires demonstration of cost effectiveness as an eligibility metric to receive funding for hazard mitigation projects. The threshold for FEMA funding for a project to be considered cost effective is a benefit cost ratio of 1 or greater. And to calculate cost effectiveness, applicants have to use FEMA approved methodologies. So to facilitate that, FEMA's created something called the BCA Toolkit. And this is basically an interface where applicants can plug in their project information to help them create the analysis that they need to submit along with their application for FEMA funding. To streamline that process further, FEMA also has released and continues to regularly release pre-calculated analyses for eligible project types. So for certain project types like acquisitions or elevations, safe rooms, there are some criteria that if your project meets those minimum criteria, it's automatically assumed to be cost effective. So that's kind of one of the ways that FEMA has already taken strides to try to simplify the BCA toolkit process for certain project types. So there are challenges with benefit cost in the FEMA context as well. Many of them are very similar to the challenges we see in the Army Corps context. FEMA's BCA toolkit itself is really designed to calculate benefits directly related to risk reduction. And it's less fitted for cataloging benefits like ecosystem services or social services, though there are strides that have been made, and I'll speak a little bit more to that in just a minute. Another challenge that's regularly cited, FEMA's BCA toolkit is guided by policies like the Office of Management and Budget's circular, which prescribes a 7% discount rate for projects. And this is often pointed to as a hindrance for approval of nature-based projects, as it artificially discounts them by 7% every year based on the time value of money rather than more accurately reflecting the reality that these projects tend to provide expanding services over time as they can kind of self-replenish and grow, and their multi-generational benefits in the face of climate change. So this particular discount rate has been an ongoing challenge when it comes to approval of nature-based projects. And then finally, in addition to having a cost-benefit ratio greater than 1, to be eligible for FEMA funding, projects are also required to demonstrate feasibility and effectiveness in reducing risk, which we often hear from folks on the ground that in the case of a nature-based project, that can involve a really expensive and complex hydraulic modeling study that can be expensive and time-consuming, and as a result, inaccessible for many communities that might otherwise be interested in these projects. So almost done, wrapping up in just a couple slides here. One important development to highlight, in October of this past year, October of 2022, FEMA actually announced an alternate cost effectiveness methodology that they are piloting for the FY22 funding round for some of their pre-disaster mitigation programs, which that application cycle actually closes later this month. The idea here is that for projects that check these 3 boxes here, they'll be considered cost effective. So those 3 boxes are: 1, that the benefit cost ratio is at least 0.75 or greater at a 7% discount rate. So functionally lowering that initial threshold to 0.75. And then at that point, it has to prove that it's 1 or greater under a 3% discount rate. And then finally, it needs to also benefit an economically disadvantaged community, address climate impacts, have hard to quantify benefits, or be subject to higher costs due to various factors. So it has to meet at least one of those variables, and with a narrative kind of explanation of how that is the case. And so it'll be really interesting to sort of see how this is actually applied in this next round for BRIC and FMA funding, and to see how many communities take advantage of this alternate approach. And then finally, just speak to some other opportunities that we see in the FEMA space here. FEMA is continually adding pre-calculated benefits to its toolkit, as I mentioned before, and we continue to encourage the agency to strive to add pre-calculated benefits for nature-based solution types where possible, and to continue its work to expand and refine the ecosystem service benefit calculations accessible through the toolkit, so that communities can take advantage of that. I do want to acknowledge that in 2021, the agency updated its policy to allow ecosystem service benefits to count from the start of a benefit cost calculation, as opposed to only coming into play after a 0.75 BCR threshold was met, then to sort of kind of top it off from there. So that was a really encouraging change that we saw. We've already talked about the discount rate, so I won't go further there. Many communities ask for more specific guidance on how to demonstrate feasibility and effectiveness for nature-based project types. And so encouraging FEMA, where possible, they provide great examples of project types through things like their mitigation action portfolio. And what we'd love to see is even more example applications that really show kind of the weedy side of this is how you can successfully demonstrate feasibility and effectiveness for various project types. And then lastly, there's already points that are given for a nature-based project component as part of FEMA's BRIC application cycle and process and criteria. However, the same number of points are available whether a project is fully nature-based or it has a smaller nature-based component. And so we certainly very supportive of these point system and want to see that continue, but we'd love to look for ways to incentivize projects that really are using nature-based solutions as the primary risk reduction strategy and not just as an add-on to an otherwise more traditional structural strategy. So those are some thoughts to kick us off. Really looking forward to the discussion, and thanks again for having me.
Well, that was great, Jesse. It's an excellent table setting presentation. And with that, I'll hand the mic to Sarah Murdoch.
Well, thank you. And let me make sure. Great. Can everyone see those and hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you. And thank you for your interest in this topic. It's certainly one that Jesse and I collaborate on and think about 24/7 practically. And since Jesse so expertly gave the overview on current federal policy we're focused on, and we're really collaborating and working together on all of the items that she went over, I'm going to use my time to share some more examples of how the Nature Conservancy and partners are advancing and valuing nature-based solution work through projects. So the Nature Conservancy is a global organization dedicated to conserving lands and waters on which life depends. We're working in all 50 states and in 72 countries. Our work on climate adaptation really is addressing impacts of flooding, drought, wildfire, and is focused on driving approaches through science-driven strategies that seek to avoid further climate impacts and mitigate existing impacts. So we're seeking to mainstream investments in nature by preserving, restoring the function of ecosystems as a means to mitigate the impacts of climate change. This is both an effective and a cost-effective approach that we feel our nation really needs to embrace. So investing in ecosystems such as floodplains, coastal wetlands, shellfish, coral reefs, mangroves, sustainable forest management, they all make sense because they provide a range of valuable benefits. These investments in ecosystems reduce the risk of climate impacts because, such as flooding, coastal erosion, drought, and wildfire risk. We know that these investments in nature result in a host of additional environmental, economic, and social benefits. You heard this from Jesse, such as filtering out pollutants, protecting water quality, providing habitat for fish, birds, and other wildlife, enhancing the quality of communities and quality of life overall. By just providing beautiful areas for recreating and access to those areas and rivers and coasts. So the Nature Conservancy has done work to both measure the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of nature-based approaches. Studies have documented the effectiveness of various ecosystems in reducing wave impacts, helping absorb floodwaters, reducing wildfire impacts. We've also teamed up with the insurance sector to apply and use their risk modeling techniques to quantify the risk reduction value of various ecosystems. So here's a couple of examples. During Hurricane Sandy in 2012, the coastal wetlands in the Northeast prevented more than $625 million in flood damages, according to a study that's been published in scientific reports. And a similar study did the same methodology, estimated that $1.5 billion in avoided property damages as a result of the Florida mangroves in place during Hurricane Irma. So now I'd like to just turn to a couple of examples of project work that has and is measuring the value of nature-based strategies. So most recently, TNC teamed up with UC Santa Cruz that's doing a lot of this valuation risk reduction work, and Earth Economics to assess the risk reduction value of coastal and coral restoration work in Hawaii. The study specifically sought to apply the cost-benefit methodology used by FEMA that Jesse talked about to determine if coral restoration would qualify as a fundable risk reduction strategy and thus be eligible for that FEMA hazard mitigation funding. So previous research determined that the overall Hawaii's coral reefs provided $3.4 million in flood protection per year. This study specifically focused its analysis in Maui, and the study compared the restoration work estimated costs as compared to the risk reduction value of the restored corals. In other words, the avoided damage to the property as a result of that restored corals. We also added in the prioritization of the coral restoration based on the ecological benefit in order to identify where the ecological and risk reduction benefits combined can be maximized. The results found that the estimated ratio of cost to benefits is greater than 1, thus making the work potentially eligible for FEMA mitigation grant funding. And I should say, I think I have studies for all the things that I'm going to talk about really briefly that I can make available, and will provide links to Sarah to share that out. In another example, this is from Puyallup River in the community of Ording in Washington State. This is a river system that has experienced chronic flooding. And during a storm in January of 2009, homes and roads and schools were flooded and 26,000 people had to evacuate. It was one of the largest evacuations ever in the state's history. Fast forward to 2014, November, when the river again flooded at about the same level as it had in 2009. Yet this time, there were almost no evacuations or flood damages. The difference between the two events was that there was extensive floodplain restoration work that had taken place in the interim. The project more than doubled the width of the river by setting back a levee about 1.5 miles and reconnecting a major side channel. It gave salmon a place to spawn and rear and allowed floodwaters to spread out and slow down. The project also created a riverfront park for the community to enjoy. And this is one project that is part of a program in Washington State called Floodplain by Design, which was launched in 2013 and recognizes the benefits of investing in floodplain restoration work aimed at yielding multiple benefits. It's led to the state appropriating about $115 million to support large-scale multiple benefit projects across the state, and it's still going strong. And it's a great example of state funding, and especially now when we have an abundance of federal funding for that was through the infrastructure bill. It allows the state to use their state funding to match and leverage that federal funding so much more readily. So there are metrics being tracked as part of the overall investments being made through the Floodplain by Design program and in this watershed. And not all of them have been translated into dollar or non-dollar values. For any valuation work, a first step is the need to create metrics that will measure benefits. So in this case, the dollar value of the risk reduction, the damage risk reduction hasn't been calculated, but you could readily calculate it. You could calculate the savings due to the limited to the no or limited evacuations, to the avoided business interruption, avoided transportation time delays, etc. But of course, the avoided damage to infrastructure, schools, and homes could be calculated as well. You could also use methods to calculate additional benefits realized, such as the recreation benefits of the parkland, perhaps the water quality benefits, or the increased fish population benefits. Not all of those can be easily assigned a dollar amount, but certainly they could be captured through ranking point system or other means. And I think Jessie made a similar point when she was talking to. It's not necessarily appropriate to put a dollar amount on all of these benefits. So my last example turns to a different type of risk, this time wildfire risk. This example is one that many of you perhaps remember. It's the tremendous tragedy of the 2018 Camp Fire that resulted in 85 deaths and destroyed over 18,000 structures in the town of Paradise, California, which is located in the foothills of Sierra Mountains. TNC is collaborating with Paradise Recreation and Park District and the Conservation Biology Institute to examine how the creation of a buffer zone around the perimeter of Paradise will contribute to reducing fire risk while also providing recreation and conservation benefits. The effectiveness of creating a buffer using parkland, orchards, or other low ignition land uses would be most effective when integrated with forest fuels management as well as property specific risk reduction techniques. To effectively create a plan for a buffer, the partnership used science and local knowledge to create a spatial data on forest fuels surrounding the town with wind directions under severe conditions and estimating the areas that were most likely to burn in the future. So this is the map that you see on the slide. Parcels were ranked by risk, and the darkest blue on this map are the highest risk and thus the highest priority for acquisition or management to create this buffer. In combination with this, we worked with the insurance company Marsh McLennan to estimate the risk reduction value of a fire buffer strategy combined with property building code updates. And they determined that if these measures are in place during the campfire, it would have reduced the risk and the damage to structures by over 42%. So FEMA actually has provided a BRIC grant, a mitigation grant for this work. And the work I have briefly described will provide the critical science and information needed to ultimately calculate a benefit cost for the risk reduction for the combined strategies of home defense, forest management, and creating that buffer. So in closing, I hope these brief examples have inspired you to begin to think about nature-based solutions and approaches and valuation of those approaches. And I look forward to the questions and discussion. Thank you.
Great, Sarah. Thank you very much. Those were great examples. I really learned a lot there. Next up is Jordan Fischbach. Take it away, Jordan.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Okay. Well, I'm going to be presenting some high-level results from policy research that we've been conducting and are actually wrapping up. And this is a project conducted at the Water Institute, where I am in partnership with the Corps of Engineers Engineering with Nature team, the RAND Corporation, the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems at the University of Georgia, and a number of other supporting stakeholders, both in and outside the Corps over the last 18 months. So the purpose of this project that I'm going to briefly describe was to first really think about this holistically and investigate how nature-based solutions have previously been evaluated at the Corps of Engineers. And second, consider what steps could better support the consideration of economic, environmental, and social benefits from nature-based solutions. So overall, we had sort of 4 key steps. We first reviewed the history of planning analysis at the core, including the evolution of the mission, the use of benefit cost analysis, the role of nature-based solutions, and recent policy developments. And Jesse talked a little bit about that earlier. We then developed an inventory of 150 feasibility studies that went all the way through the decision process, resulting in a signed chief's report that were completed from about 2005 to 2020. Subject matter experts at the core provided survey input on the consideration of nature-based solutions in these studies, and we used that input to calculate summary statistics and identify a subset for additional analysis. We then reviewed relevant planning frameworks and valuation methods that could help to better support the evaluation of benefits and co-benefits from nature-based solutions. And finally, we did a deep dive. We conducted 6 retrospective case studies to better understand how nature-based solutions were or were not carried through all of the evaluation steps, and tested different methods intended to capture a wider range of benefits. So Jesse had mentioned this previously, but a lot of this was undergirded by the new principles, requirements, and guidelines. These were actually developed from about 2009 to 2013, and the PRNG, as it's referred to, lays out broad principles for evaluation and establishes 6 co-equal guiding principles to guide water resources planning. So it really encourages both multi-objective analysis and calls for a more flexible benefit cost analysis that incorporates ecosystem services. So as you can see here, those 6 principles are healthy and resilient ecosystems, sustainable economic development, floodplain management, public safety, environmental justice, and an overall watershed approach. And a key goal of our research was to consider approaches that would help to support the implementation of this new PRNG framework. In the next phase of our research, the study team worked with core experts to identify 6 case studies from the initial set of 150 that considered nature-based solutions during alternative formulation or evaluation, carried those nature-based solutions through a significant portion of the process, and had a strong local sponsor interest in implementing those solutions. Final decisions were based on diverse representation across study location, purpose, project implementation stage, complexity, and the availability of information for reanalysis. So this slide shows where we ended up, the location and purpose for each of these case studies. These included Jamaica Bay in New York, South Platte River and tributaries in Colorado, Southwest coastal Louisiana, Mile Point in Jacksonville Harbor, Florida, West Sacramento, California, certainly an area that we're looking at for flood risk management right at this moment, and South San Francisco Bay. So I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to bring back 2 of these case studies as quick examples to support some of the key findings from the study. So in my remaining time, what I want to do is give a high-level overview of the initial key findings and recommendations that emerged from our evaluation and cross-cutting analysis of these 6 studies. These are organized roughly as shown on this slide, corresponding to the key steps in a study process: scoping, formulation, non-monetized evaluation, monetized evaluation, and then finally prioritization and project selection. So you can kind of keep track of this by looking at the color and looking at the corresponding header on the left of each of the slides. All right, so starting with scoping. From the initial inventory of completed planning studies developed for this research, scoring by core subject matter experts indicated that approximately 85% of those that they had information to score started out considering nature-based solutions in some way, but only about half of the studies evaluated nature-based solutions in that final array of alternatives. So we lost about half along the way from that 85%. Many of these remaining studies were focused solely on environmental restoration, meaning that less than a third of the studies, starting from that bigger bucket, both considered nature-based solutions and evaluated them across multiple objectives together. For example, looking at both flood risk management and restoration. This carried through when we actually looked at our detailed analysis. Although all but one of the 6 evaluated planning studies that we looked at in case study analysis identified multiple goals that could be addressed through integrated nature-based solutions, most studies formulated and evaluated these goals separately by mission area rather than holistically. As a result, the first key finding from this collective body of work is that the process of study scoping within specific mission areas can limit the consideration of nature-based solutions. In many cases, nature-based solutions actually tended to be excluded very early in the planning process. So to address this finding, our recommendation is to consider an integrated multi-objective study scope as the default, as the baseline to begin future studies. This would entail incorporating input from non-federal sponsors and stakeholders to inform the objectives that the study will address, considering the potential for benefits across all of those PRNG principles, and ensuring that all alternatives would both address the authorized project purpose and address other relevant PRNG principles. All right, turning next to the process of formulating different alternatives, we found that the process and assumptions that undergird formulation plays an essential role in considering or excluding integrated nature-based solutions. Most of the studies we reviewed excluded nature-based solutions intended to support flood risk reduction, either before or during this formulation process, often because alternatives were formulated separately for each mission area, as I noted before. Formulation was based on fundamentally different approaches, such as putting in sort of a bucket of one with structural solutions and another one with non-structural risk reduction, for example. And then finally, there were cases where preliminary analysis screened out integrated approaches in favor of more narrowly tailored options that are economically justifiable in isolation. So this is the use of benefit cost analysis as a screening tool that actually took out many of those options early in the process. So building from that finding, our recommendation is that future studies develop integrated alternatives during the formulation process that are designed explicitly to meet multiple objectives. This would entail ensuring that alternatives are designed to provide benefits or co-benefits across all relevant PRNG principles and to different communities of interest, explicitly considering nature-based solutions in alternative formulation for all relevant studies, and as I noted before, focusing initial screening on feasibility and cost rather than on overall economic performance. So we next considered how the potential outcomes from these alternatives were evaluated using non-monetary metrics, as Jesse and Sarah both described before, in the selected case studies. We found that some environmental, social, or other non-economic metrics may be estimating with existing tools at the core, while others will require additional modeling not typically incorporated into a planning study. That said, we also found that the evaluation of nature-based solutions across multiple objectives could be augmented with relevant science developed independently of the study, expert knowledge, and as Sarah noted, traditional and community knowledge. So based on our review and analysis, we recommend evaluating alternatives using metrics from all relevant PRNG guiding principles and communities of interest. This very much builds on what Sarah found and what she described in her case study outcomes. Core practitioners would likely need additional resources to help and implement this recommendation, including expanding the core certified modeling toolkit to support alternatives evaluation for multiple outcomes, as well as developing updated guidance for using multiple lines of evidence regarding project benefits and costs. All right, next, turning specifically to ecosystem services valuation. We found that there are existing methods that can help to augment studies and improve the estimation of monetized benefits. So there are methods available to estimate monetized benefits from ecosystem services, including some that are already in use by the Corps of Engineers. An expanded use of benefit transfer, the ability to take results from one economic study and apply them in another situation, which FEMA does all the time with those pre-calculated benefits, would also allow for broader evaluation of nature-based solutions in the Corps' benefit cost analysis. So an example of this is actually our case study in Jacksonville Harbor, specifically Mile Point. We conducted a reanalysis of a recent study focused on this portion of Jacksonville Harbor. The study was designed to reduce cross currents and shoreline erosion at Mile Point along the St. Johns River, which represented safety risks and threatened surrounding development. We leveraged existing data to estimate the monetized benefits from water quality improvement, new access to waterways, and the avoided cost of additional sediment disposal. We were able to leverage an economic hedonic study of home prices in the area for the first two categories, while a cost comparison of disposal sites provided a new estimate of the reduced sediment disposal costs. Our results show that the recommended plan benefit cost ratio increased from 1.4 to 2.3 when including these additional categories of benefit. Though it didn't change the ranking of alternatives, this case study demonstrated how ecosystem service valuation could augment study analysis and potentially tip the balance from a net negative to a net positive result. Based on our findings, we recommend developing additional guidance and resources for monetizing environmental and social benefits. This could leverage existing core methods, such as recreational use day values or dredge disposal cost estimation. In addition, the Corps could develop a benefit transfer database and decision support tools to support ecosystem valuation within its benefit cost analysis. And this could certainly build on similar efforts by other agencies, including FEMA, EPA, and NOAA. So overall, our case study results showed, when we thought about this from the valuation perspective, that incorporating ecosystem service valuation increased the ratio of benefits to cost in some studies, but decreased the ratio in others due to the increasing costs, the increased costs when we added those in. That said, incorporating additional ecosystem service benefits did not change the alternative rankings based on BCA alone. However, in most cases, this was due to decisions that were made upstream during scoping, screening, and formulation, as well as limits on available data for reanalysis. So given present constraints on data and methods, we found that not monetized valuation alone was not able to fully represent the PRNG principles, values, and associated benefits from the water resources case studies considered. And this really undergirds what Jesse spoke about and what Sarah just spoke about as well, from their perspectives. Multi-objective analysis will therefore remain necessary to consider the full range of benefits, whether or not the use of ecosystem service valuation is expanded. So perhaps the best example that we found of a multi-mission study designed to address multiple goals from our case study reanalysis is the South San Francisco Bay, California shoreline study. This is an area prone to tidal flooding, which is anticipated to increase due to sea level rise. And commercial salt pond development has led to the loss of tidal marsh habitat, and what remains there is largely fragmented. The study was scoped to reduce risk from tidal flooding, restore ecological function, and improve public access, education, and recreation. Flood risk reduction and recreation were valued in dollar terms, while improved ecological function was measured in other units. To address these goals, the San Francisco District of the Corps formulated multi-purpose alternatives with nature-based solutions that included a combination of levee building, tidal marsh restoration, and recreational features. The district also considered an ecotone transitional habitat for the foreshore of the levee and accelerated marsh restoration techniques. But these improvements were not included in the recommended plan because the benefit cost ratio was slightly lower than an alternative without these additional features, though benefits still exceeded costs at more than a 5-to-1 ratio. However, these additional nature-based elements were ultimately included in the project as part of the locally preferred plan, with the local sponsor responsible for the additional costs. This project is a strong exemplar for future studies, especially with respect to the scoping and alternative formulation. However, it also helps to illustrate the pitfalls of prioritization using the benefit cost ratio as a primary criterion. Because some potential benefits were difficult to value in dollar terms, a multi-criteria prioritization approach might have led to the conclusion that a slight reduction in the project benefit cost ratio is worth the trade-off for the additional non-monetized benefits from the ecotone levee and the accelerated restoration approach. So this helpful example points to our final recommendation: adopt transparent, multi-criteria decision analysis as the primary approach for alternative ranking and selection. Specifically, this would entail bringing together both economic and non-economic quantitative outputs, augmenting quantitative assessment with qualitative information, such as local knowledge and values, along with expert input, and prioritizing alternatives that provide balanced benefits across all relevant PRNG guiding principles, rather than optimizing for a single mission. So based on this research, we would still recommend augmenting benefit cost analysis with ecosystem service valuation where practical and appropriate, but with an eye towards using BCA as a minimum threshold for cost reasonableness, similarly to how it is currently applied in the FEMA approach that Jesse outlined earlier, rather than as the primary criterion for alternative ranking. In this way, incremental improvement to valuation can still be incorporated, but will not be a requirement to the broader consideration of nature-based solutions. Using this approach would help to ensure a minimum level of economic performance from the recommended alternative, while avoiding the use of benefit cost analysis to exclude alternatives with nature-based solutions. This would likely still undercount some benefits when calculating the benefit cost analysis, or calculating the BCR for cost reasonableness, but the improved valuation approaches could help to close this gap. All right, so what's next? We are in the very final stages of this study. We have 2 reports published that we, I think, can share or are sharing through chat, describing earlier phases of the work. And these are published and available through the Engineering with Nature website, while 2 other reports describing our review of the methodology as well as the case study results in detail are in final stages of development and review and are expected to be published soon. So I wanted to end by just highlighting a couple of quick next steps for us as well. We are going to be conducting additional analysis using the same set of 6 case studies to specifically consider social outcomes and equity as part of the overall study process and BCA analysis. And progress on comprehensive benefits analysis for nature-based solutions is going to be supported by developing updated guidance, tools, and additional support to help carry the new process through to future planning studies by the Corps. So I just want to say thank you. It's really great to be able to share the overall results from this research, and I'm looking forward to the discussion to follow.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Jordan, and thank you to Sarah and Jesse. In this second part of the webinar, I'll pose some questions to the panel, and each person will get a chance to respond to each question, but it's intended to be an open discussion among the panelists. So one place I wanted to start here is that it's come up a couple of times, the new FEMA cost benefit policy. FEMA just issued new guidance. And as Jesse indicated, some projects could exceed monetized benefits in some cases, in other words, a negative benefit to cost ratio or BCA. And the new FEMA policy also identified some factors that could be considered outside of the cost benefit calculation, including benefits to disadvantaged communities and climate change considerations. So for each of the panelists, what are your views generally on this new FEMA policy, and would it be likely to result in increased approval of nature-based projects? And how might it be more generally applied beyond FEMA to cost benefit analysis by other agencies or for other programs? Someone want to jump in on that?
I'm happy to jump in. You know, I think I'm really encouraged by this development, and I think that you know, it's a first step. It's a kind of a time-bound experiment. It seems like that FEMA's making, you know, kind of near term with this next round of applications. But I think that the combination of experimenting with different discount rates to see how that might change what projects make it kind of through the gauntlet, at the same time as encouraging sort of the narrative, you know, non-quantitative component of project justification, and like the pairing of those things, I think is a really smart way to kind of test drive some of these important ideas. So I'm excited. I'm hopeful that FEMA and all of us will learn a lot from this kind of initial experiment, and that there will be perhaps even some changes that could follow more comprehensively to things like the OMB discount rate and what applies in the circular.
Yeah, I'll just build on that a little bit. And I think it's something, a point that Jordan made, which is, will be yes to everything Jesse said. It will be really important for FEMA to be transparent and provide those specific examples that Jesse talked about needing, because without that, we can't properly evaluate whether or not these changes are having the positive effect that we hope they will. They should, based on, you know, what we know, but we don't know. There's so much detail and complexity in all of this that we need to see that calculation and the evaluation criteria specifically, and how they're evaluating the non-monetary pieces too, because that's really, really an important component. And it's challenging, but Without that transparency, we won't fully be able to see how effective these changes are. And I think, we need to have on the table much more significant measures that maybe do away with such a technical BCA for classes of projects.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in and build on what Sarah just said, because I think it's my expectation is that this is, I will say overall, I'm really encouraged by this, and I'm excited to see what's going to come from it. But I still see it as something that's on the margin for exactly the reasons that Sarah described. You still need to conduct, benefit cost analysis, and you still need the technical analysis that informs that. And so, Jesse spoke earlier about concerns about procedural equity, communities that just simply don't have the resources or the ability to do that kind of detailed technical analysis. And one of the main challenges is that solutions that combine traditional and nature-based solutions are just harder to evaluate. And so you're sort of adding the level of technical complexity on there and still requiring a benefit cost analysis. And in many cases, even communities that are well able to conduct analysis of traditional infrastructure might struggle with the integrated analysis they need to look at these combined solutions. So I think it's a really good step in the right direction. I agree with Sarah that kind of getting transparency about how well this is working, but I think that procedural equity component is still really going to remain, and we're going to need more steps to be able to make this process simpler, more transparent, and more accessible for a range of communities.
Great, thank you. One obstacle to advancing nature-based solutions is a perception that they offer only short-term or unreliable response to address a project purpose, such as flood control, when compared to structural alternatives. However, new international guidelines for nature-based solutions published in 2021 do provide a framework for evaluating nature-based solutions and should help address project performance uncertainty. Do you all feel that the new guidelines are enough to build high confidence in the performance of nature-based solutions? Or is there a need for a more structured assessment of project performance over time with regular reporting and or perhaps updating of design standards?
I'll try to jump in on this. This is a big question. First of all, I haven't really ever heard that it's the evaluation of performance over short term, because in reality, nature-based solutions are least effective the first day that the project is done and grow in effectiveness over time because of growth and ecosystem function enhancing over time. And gray solutions to counter that are the most effective the day the project's done and decrease in effectiveness as time marches on. So often people raising the critique aren't stating that second point, which is, just because of degrading of materials over time, those projects become less effective over time. That's also something that's not usually calculated in cost benefit. So getting back to cost benefit. To your point on guidance, yeah, I think the international guidelines are really important. It was a hugely collaborative effort to put those together. Lots and lots of really great science people leading on this work around the world, contributing. So very, very important. But I also don't want folks to get trapped in, we just need more and more and more technical guidance, because there's so much variety in scale and ecosystem type and geography. We're never gonna have precise guidelines for every single scenario. And I think we know enough about basic ecosystem function to be able to advance this work in lots of different places and lots of different scales and lots of different scenarios in combination with great infrastructure. You know, we're not blind that, you know, nature is the answer for every single scenario. So anyway, that I could say a lot more, but I'll stop there and let my colleagues chime in.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe I'll hop in here. I think I agree with everything that Sarah said, and I think also part of this is just and this hopefully carried through in my presentation as well. It's a mindset shift in some ways, because I think even the nature of the question sort of presupposes that there are these set of green or nature-based solutions that are going to themselves and by themselves solve problems, right? And I think really what you find is like it's always going to be a range and a mix of what we consider traditional infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and we're asking too much of green solutions in terms of of this kind of approach, and very much building on that. You know, that fits in with the process of evaluation that I described for the core. So if you've got a nature-based, like a green plan, and you've got a traditional plan, and you're competing them against each other, for sort of an approach like asset damage reduction for flood risk, then you're going to come to the same answer most of the time, as opposed to thinking about this as gradations and as different combinations of traditional and nature-based solutions that are designed to solve the problem while addressing other benefits at once. And if you set a different baseline, it's okay, we need to do this every time, and this needs to be a component of our thinking in every project. That fundamentally changes this and gets out of that mode of competing, or sort of you know, thinking that there's one track or another in terms of solving these problems.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I mean, agree with all of that. And I think sort of to that last point Jordan made, you know, one thing that we hope to see as the Army Corps implements the principles, requirements, and guidelines. And Jordan, I love that slide you showed about, you know, what they were meant to represent, or what you know, kind of what they say to do. Really beautifully laid out. But you know, one thing I think we hope that we can move toward is a scenario where you look at a problem and you say, how can we use nature to solve this problem, either in whole or in part? And in the scenarios where nature can be a big part of the problem, but not all of the solution, or a big part of the solution, but not all of it, we have a hybrid proposal. And then in some cases, we're really just going to need a structural solution, right? But to flip it on its head and lead with nature as the primary solution, and then where that's not sufficient, or where that's not sufficient alone, we then move on to kind of some of the approaches that folks maybe are more familiar or comfortable with, but aren't necessarily the ones that are going to create the greatest co-benefits, you know, for society.
That's great, thank you. So the environmental benefits of nature-based solutions are commonly cited as wildlife habitat and cleaner water and improved recreational amenities. But as you all have pointed out in your presentations, there are important social benefits of nature-based approaches, including benefits like preserving history and culture, and reducing spillover effects of a project to a neighboring community. So what is y'all's assessment of the importance of nature-based solutions in the context of what we usually think of as kind of the environmental, that we think first of the environmental benefits? And are there steps that we need to take to better define these social benefits in the context of the project alternatives analysis?
So maybe I'll start. I think first and foremost, to that point about the social benefits, is about thinking more broadly about who's actually benefited or impacted by a project. So one thing that does happen is you have this very precise definition of a geography or a particular area. One thing that, you know, nature-based solutions and the restoration approach can provide is benefits to a much broader potential population that can benefit from that. So I think starting out by thinking bigger about both the the scale of what that project will impact, and then the communities that could benefit or be impacted by it, is really important. And I often what happens, and we saw this in that funnel that I described earlier, is everything gets winnowed down into these very precise categories for economic evaluation, and you lose so much of the richness of actually what is this project going to do, and what are the downstream impacts of that project. Now, ironically, we thought about this a lot, but there's actually a process to bring a lot of those back into the fore, and that's through environmental impact statements that are typically done after the decision is made. And there's a lot of information that's included that actually speaks to environmental and social impacts in an environmental impact statement. The problem is that's already after the decision has been made. And so in some ways, a lot of our recommendations are along the lines of carrying that analysis forward and doing that first, and thinking broadly about those categories of impact or benefit first, and then using that to help define the scope of the study itself, and then to actually help define out what the alternative should be.
One of the things that comes to mind in thinking about this question too is that driving the choice of, solution it needs to be a community included led process. And when you do that, you inherently bring into consideration these social benefit issues that the federal agencies aren't great at leading on. So it just brings them to the fore. So if you're doing proper project planning, then it should bring, include that community and be led by that community perspective, and that will drive better the incorporation and consideration for social benefits. So that's just comes to mind when I'm thinking about this issue too.
Yeah, and I thought something very similar, Sarah, and just to say that if there isn't a kind of a community driven approach to defining the problem and the solutions, there can actually be unintended adverse impacts, even from nature-based solutions, right? And so really appreciating that the community really needs to be part of that conversation and defining the goals right out of the gate, so that we do design projects that are actually meeting community needs and desires and benefits the people that they're intended to serve, without any unintended consequences like gentrification, things that can happen that can actually push people out of the area where the project might be.
Okay, thanks. Before we go to audience questions, which we have a bunch of, I wanted to give each of you a chance to mention anything important that we haven't discussed, or to reflect on what the biggest challenges or the biggest opportunities for planning and implementing resilient and equitable nature-based solutions may be.
I personally think I could say a lot more, but I would love to just go to the audience now. They've been patiently listening, so I'm happy to field other questions, audience questions.
Okay,
Yeah, I agree.
Let's jump into those audience questions. So I've been reading them as they come in, and I'll try and keep up with them. But there are a couple of I think pretty good ones here, and so there is a question: how can we ensure that floodplain restoration is set up with a multi-use sort of approach, so that I think this gets to both what Sarah and Jordan were saying about the need to consider multiple benefits, and not to design a project that is just laser focused on one thing, but delivers lots of things, whether it's environmental or social. And I think the question is asking, how can we actually make that a reality? A good idea, how do we make it happen?
That's a great question. We're actually doing, and I think we'll be releasing a report on the story of the Washington Floodplain by Design program that I talked about, and the what we call enabling conditions that led to the creation of that. First and foremost, there needs to be drivers in terms of commonly perceived impacts that need to be addressed. So in that case, it was salmon population decline. It was frequent flooding. It was impacts to ag property, ag land. And there's strong recreation interests in that state. So all those issues combined, and they deliberately pulled together the various stakeholders who had interest in those different issues, and that led to the advocacy to create this multi-benefit program. So it wasn't easy and it took a long time, but it's withstood, a little bit of the test of time, and is proving to be really effective. So we're hoping to replicate that in other places and looking at how we could do that by looking at those conditions. But
yeah, and I noted in that question too, the specific concern about like local regulatory issues that come up when you're actually trying to implement. So one thing I would just briefly add is this is another argument for that level, like a high level of engagement prior to the project, right, or leading into the project. And we mentioned kind of community engagement, but that also goes for local agencies, and probably a wider range of local agencies than would be typically be in the conversation as non-federal sponsors, or specifically as water resources agencies, recognizing, okay, you're broadening out the range of objectives you're trying to achieve that also covers domain that is now covered by more local agencies. So yes, it makes it more complicated, but it also suggests that early engagement on these types of solutions with local decision makers and local regulators is not going to solve the problem in itself, but is a step towards improving implementation or helping to avoid major issues that would come up during the implementation phase.
Okay. Another question here. It concerns the role of insurance. And do you all see that insurance might play a role as an incentive or disincentive for investing in hazard mitigation, and particularly with respect to a nature-based solution?
so I can take that a little bit. TNC's done quite a bit of work in this space. It's complicated. But the reinsurance industry we partnered with and actually have created and implemented a couple of examples of insurance products that actually are triggered to pay out when disasters occur and get reinvested into nature-based solution. And actually, in both cases, it's coral reef restoration. We have an international example of that in Mexico, and then just launched one in Hawaii. It gets a lot more complicated when you get in the US because of the existence of the federal flood insurance program. But it is definitely something we're looking at. We're also looking at it in the wildfire space where you don't have the complication of the US public flood insurance market. So there's some promise there. There's a lot of complexities, but these projects that have been created, especially as mechanisms internationally, I think it holds more promise internationally personally, but there's interest on behalf of the insurance companies to explore these options.
And I'll just add, and TNC's work in that space is so exciting, Sarah, all of those examples. When it comes to kind of our national flood insurance program, I think a lot about how there is an opportunity, if we really do have kind of a risk-based approach, to try to disincentivize future risky development in what we know is sort of an expanding floodplain in the face of climate change. And also, to try to avoid and protect what we have left of our actual natural floodplain habitat, which we should always remember is itself, natural infrastructure. And in many cases, some of the best natural infrastructure we have, because it's easier to protect and enhance in many cases than to restore and start over, right? And so if we have the right incentives in place as part of our national flood insurance program, we should hopefully be trying to avoid, future development of our natural floodplain ecosystems. And one thing to flag that we haven't noted yet today, I don't think, is we're hopeful to see an update to FEMA's minimum floodplain management standards at some point soon. There was an initial kind of request for information, I believe it was last year. So I think that will be, if that hopefully proceeds swiftly, that will be a real opportunity for us to take a look at what is the incentive structure here, and how do we ensure that we're trying to protect the natural floodplain habitat that we have left.
Well, thank you. Jordan, did you want to speak to that, or are you okay?
Yeah, we can move on. Thanks.
Okay. Well, changing gears just a little bit, there is a question here that probably worth just talking about a little bit. Is if nature-based solution, it's a really great idea. Where's the opposition, or is there opposition? Is there political opposition? Is there agency reluctance to move in this direction? Or basically, is everybody on the bus ready to go? How do we kind of think about that problem and understand it so that we can make progress?
I mean, it's a really big question. Maybe I'll try to take a cut at this. Again, I hope this came across in some of my earlier remarks, but it's some ways a paradigm shift. And actually, what Jesse had mentioned earlier, like we also looked at kind of previous phases of the Corps' evaluation analysis process. Even though they've been using benefit cost analysis for a long time, there are these different stages that the Corps has gone through at the direction of Congress in terms of how they evaluated. And in earlier eras, even within the 20th century, the idea of actually putting co-equal these environmental, social and economic benefits was better understood. So there's a period in the 60s and where that was sort of the norm, and benefit cost analysis was a component of that. But it's really been a generation that we've been proceeding with this approach. And so there's a lot of moving parts that you need to change, even if everyone's on board and agrees in principle, changing all the different pieces that you need, both in terms of the legal considerations, the process considerations, actually translating this through to all of the relevant agencies. And then for the folks in those agencies, giving them the tools and resources needed to actually implement a new approach. It's turning a very large ship very slowly. So I think what I sense is that there is a lot more consensus around bringing these kinds of solutions and the need to think more broadly in terms of benefits. But in terms of the details of doing it, it's still going to be a long and challenging process to put all those pieces in place.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there's wholesale opposition. I mean, I think there's lack of maybe certainly a spectrum of understanding in terms of, how nature performs and, the effectiveness and to be clear, there's not precise answers on every performance related to nature-based solutions. So there is more to learn there and more science to be done. But I think, yeah, it's behavior change, which within large institutions, federal government is just gonna take time for all the reasons that Jordan talked about, and at all levels of government and all levels of society. So.
Agree completely with all that. And I think, we have this incredible near-term opportunity with all of the funding that just came through various congressional packages. And something of note there is that, more and more we have federal funding streams where natural infrastructure is an eligible use of funds, which is exciting. We have agencies that haven't necessarily done as much in this space that are now kind of authorized by Congress to take on more of these projects. And the hard part is, this is new kind of muscle memory, for a lot of entities within the federal family. And then there's that added layer of how do we make sure we're, using letting every agency play to their strengths and use all of the best information we can across the federal family too, which that coordination piece is so important and so work intensive. It's really hard. So I think we're encouraged that there's a lot. Obviously, the roadmap webinar coming up in next week or very soon is an exciting opportunity to learn more about all of that kind of work across the federal family. But certainly there's this near-term chance to try to have the rubber meet the road with some of the funding that's come through.
And I just thought of something to add. I mean, I think that the question gets at to maybe a little bit of the politics, and Jesse and I both do, lobby work on the Hill. This is an area where we've seen bipartisan support, even in this crazy Congress that we're dealing with. And so that encourages us a lot. We've been able to advance investments in nature, and it showed up big time in the infrastructure bill because there was bipartisan support for it. So that is a glimmer of hope that we like to point to in our crazy world of Congress right now.
Well, just to add a little bit to the point Jordan was making earlier, clearly there's some real potential for good leadership in the agencies and elsewhere to help hold up these new ideas and help give them greater acceptance. I don't believe you actually mentioned, but I know you were involved in the summit meeting in Washington late last year, which was a chance for lots of people working on some of these issues, including senior leadership of the Biden administration, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, and others to show up at a meeting and talk to people about some of these challenges. I don't know if you want to say anything more about the summit, or where perhaps, if you know, where the Corps plans to take some of that work.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. One is kind of where I left off, which is the Corps is currently in the process of going through a rulemaking for the principles, requirements, and guidelines. So we're waiting to see what the results of that process will be in terms of laying that out in detail. And I should also note that the White House roadmap on nature-based solutions, which I think came out just a few weeks before the summit, and was really nicely timed with a lot of the work that we've been doing as well. But I think ultimately the purpose of the summit was to address exactly what Jesse said, which is actually to get members, many different members of the federal family together and talking about the various approaches that they're taking to hear about some other work. And it was great, actually, particularly hearing the federal panel and some of the state and locals be able to share their best practice and share what they're doing, and hear also from federal agencies about the need for that consistent information sharing as they collectively move through this and they respond to White House mandates in this direction. So it was a great start, and it was a great conversation. And actually, Jesse and I were in a breakout group together at the summit, and one thing that did come up is actually the need to move beyond kind of these higher level conversations and move into more consistent information sharing at a staff level. And so that could be a greater challenge, but is one that one item that came up that stuck in my head from the summit as a potential need moving forward to actually systematize this across the federal agencies.
And the only thing I'll add is the point, Jeff, that you were making, which it was. So I participated in one of the speaking panels as well, and it was the first time I heard the heads of multiple agencies, including Council on Environmental Quality, talk in depth about nature-based solutions. I mean, they weren't just doing platitudes and kind of buzzwords. They were actually talking about substantive things that each of their agencies were leading and doing. So that stuck with me, as a milestone, and just shows you the opportunity, get back to Jesse's point, the opportunity we have now with this particular administration and the leadership in place.
Okay. Well, I have one other question here. It's kind of a hard one, but it's maybe a good one to end on. Sorry to give you a tough one here at the end, but the question is, while an improvement, the described alternative FEMA discount rate application seemingly does not address the inherent limitations of static linear discount rates. Do the panelists have opinions as to other better options for discounting?
That
I'm
is.
going to let Jordan, the economist, answer that
Do
one.
that to you.
I will note I'm a policy analyst with some economics training, not an economist. But I will, I'll say that, there certainly are other discounting approaches that are discussed, and economists are working in many different dimensions to think about appropriate discounting for long-term issues, for intergenerational issues, and thinking about discounting that's actually more appropriate when we're looking at long-term climate solutions, for example. And I don't want to go into too much depth because we have 4 minutes left. But one thing I'll say is that there is some promise there, but the more you go into those more complicated approaches, the more black box they get. And so people won't understand what's coming out of there, or will just be sort of cranking through and getting a result. One nice thing about the sort of linear discounting approach is it's relatively simple and most people can use it. And so where I tend to come down is it's more important to focus on exactly what Jesse noted, which is that lower discount rates are more appropriate for many solutions, and thinking much more beyond a private discount rate of 7% is probably going to give a lot more value in the near term towards justifying these in benefit cost terms than trying to pursue really complicated discounting approaches. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, well, that's a good answer. And why don't we end our audience question section on that? And as you pointed out, we're almost at the end of our time. So in closing, I wanted to, first of all, thank each of the panelists for great presentations and for very thoughtful discussion and responses to questions. I know I learned a lot. I hope the many people who tuned in to the webinar also were enlightened as I was. Second, I want to thank Sarah Mason at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions for sponsoring and supporting the webinar. Thank you very much, Sarah. This has been great. If anyone has any questions they would like to follow up, feel free to email Sarah or me. We'll post our email addresses in the chat box, and we're always happy to do follow-up. We will, of course, email to everyone who registered a link for the webinar recording, and we'll post the webinar recordings on the websites of the sponsoring organization. So we hope to share this as widely as possible and promote a little of that education that we were talking about. And then finally, thank you to everyone who tuned into the webinar for putting your thinking cap on for a difficult and sometimes challenging topic for an hour and a half. So we really appreciate everybody tuning in and asking a lot of great questions, and we're looking forward to moving nature-based solutions ahead very successfully in the coming years. With that, I think I can say for the panel and for the sponsors, thank you again, and have a good day.
Thanks so much.